I'm a 38-year-old divorced father of two, and until a few weeks ago, I thought I had a solid co-parenting situation. My ex-wife and I split custody 50-50, and I've always made an effort to be present in my kids' lives. I never missed a school event, a birthday, or a weekend with them. But then I got a call that shattered everything I thought I knew. It was my son's school counselor. She sounded hesitant at first, like she wasn't sure she should even be calling me, but eventually she told me she was concerned. Apparently, my 12-year-old son had mentioned in a conversation that I had come back after being gone for years. She said he seemed deeply conflicted about my presence, like he wasn't sure if he should trust me. She asked if something had happened recently to make him feel that way. I told her there had to be a misunderstanding. I had been in my children's lives the whole time, sharing custody evenly with my ex. I reassured her that I wasn't some absent father who had suddenly returned. She seemed relieved but suggested I talk to my son to clear things up. After that call, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. It didn't make sense. I saw my kids all the time. Why would my son think I had come back? I started paying more attention when I picked them up that evening. My son, normally chatty, barely said anything. My 9-year-old daughter was even worse. She wouldn't meet my eyes, keeping her head down the entire time. At first, I thought maybe they were just tired, but then I noticed something else. My daughter flinched slightly when I reached out to ruffle her hair. That wasn't normal. Later that night, while driving my son to soccer practice, he muttered something under his breath. It was so quiet I almost missed it. I don't get why you came back if you never wanted us. I nearly slammed on the brakes. My heart started pounding. I asked him what he meant, but he just shrugged, suddenly acting like he hadn't said anything. I pressed him, telling him I needed to know what was going on. After a long silence, he finally mumbled, "Grandma and Grandpa said you left when we were little, that you only came back because you felt bad." I couldn't breathe. I pulled the car over and turned to face him, trying to keep my voice steady. I asked him how long he had believed that. He hesitated, then admitted always. That word nearly destroyed me. I asked him if his mom had told him that. He shook his head. "Grandma said it a lot. She said you were too busy for us back then. That's why we stayed with them so much." I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what I was hearing. My own parents had been feeding my children a lie for years, making them believe I had abandoned them. I had been right there, watching my kids grow up, completely unaware that every hug, every bedtime story, every "I love you" had been laced with doubt in their minds. I immediately called my ex-wife. She answered with a sigh, like she already knew why I was calling. I barely got a word in before she said, "I thought you knew." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. She explained that she had tried to correct our kids a few times but thought I had already figured out where the lie was coming from. Since my parents babysat often during the early years of the divorce, she assumed I had known they were influencing the kids and had chosen not to intervene. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My kids had believed this for years, and no one had told me. I drove straight to my parents' house. My mother opened the door with a warm smile, completely unbothered, like she hadn't been poisoning my children against me behind my back. My father sat on the couch, staring at the TV. When I demanded to know why they had told my kids I abandoned them, he sighed but didn't look at me. "It's not that simple," he muttered, but he didn't argue with my mother either. It was clear where his loyalties lay, or at least where his silence did. My mother blinked at me, unfazed. "We only told them what they needed to hear," she said. "You were never really there." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. I reminded her that I had shared custody, that I had been in my kids' lives every single week since the divorce. She just shrugged. "They spent more time with us when they were younger. We raised them when you were too busy." That was when it hit me. Every time they had offered to babysit, every time they had insisted the kids stay over at their house, they had been planting the seeds for this lie. Every little comment about me being too busy wasn't just a casual remark. It was deliberate. They had been rewriting history right in front of me, and I hadn't even seen it happening. I looked at my father, waiting for him to say something. He just turned the TV volume up. That was it for me. I told them they wouldn't be seeing my kids again until they fixed what they had done. My mother scoffed, acting like I was being dramatic. "You're overreacting," she said. "They'll understand when they're older." I left without another word. I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to try to convince them to undo what they had done. They had stolen years of bonding from me and my children, and they didn't even care. When I got home, I looked at my kids differently. I saw all the times they had hesitated before hugging me, the way they never really opened up to me like they should have. I had been trying to connect with them, while my parents were quietly building a wall between us. I wasn't going to let it continue. At the next custody exchange, I sat my kids down at my place. I kept my voice calm, asking what they believed about me. My son glanced at his sister, hesitating. My daughter didn't speak at all. I told them they weren't in trouble, that I just wanted to understand. My son finally spoke. "Grandma said you left because you didn't love us enough." My daughter, barely looking up, whispered, "Did you even want us, Dad?" The words hit like a sledgehammer, but I didn't let it show. I pulled out my phone and showed them pictures, birthday parties, school events, vacations, and simple moments of us together. I had saved every message I ever sent their mother about them, court papers showing our custody agreement, and even old drawings they had made for me when they were little. "You were always with me," I said. I never left. My son stared at the pictures, his fingers hovering over a photo of us at his 5th birthday party. His eyes flickered with doubt, but I could see something shifting. My daughter, though, barely looked. Her arms were crossed, her expression set. Grandma says people can fake pictures, she muttered. I didn't push. Instead, I told them we could talk more later, that I'd always be here for them. My son nodded. My daughter didn't respond. The next day, I met with my ex-wife. She admitted she had underestimated the damage. She had thought the kids would eventually see the truth on their own. But after hearing what they said to me, she realized they had internalized the lies. She agreed we needed to do something. We found a therapist who specialized in children dealing with manipulation and family conflict. My son agreed to go. My daughter crossed her arms and said she didn't need fixing. I was still trying to figure out how to handle that when my mother called. The moment I answered, she launched into a furious rant. She had heard about the therapy and accused me of brainwashing my kids against her. I told her she would not see them until she admitted to lying. She scoffed. I only told them the truth, she said. You were always too busy. I hung up. I wasn't going to argue with someone who believed her own lies. Word spread fast. Some relatives sided with me, saying they had always suspected my parents of overstepping. Others accused me of being too harsh. One aunt told me I needed to forgive and move on because my parents only did what they thought was best. Then my younger sister called. She had always been the quiet one in the family, keeping her distance from our parents. She told me she had suspected for years that they were manipulating my kids, but didn't know how to bring it up. She offered to talk to them, to gently nudge them toward the truth. I agreed. A few days later, I noticed a change. My son started texting me more, asking if he could come over even on days that weren't mine. He was starting to question everything. My daughter, though, refused to stay at my place. She told my ex that she felt safer at grandma's. That was when I knew my mother had been feeding her more than just the original lie. I started digging. My sister helped, recalling things she had overheard when visiting. Then my ex told me something that made my blood run cold. My mother had told my daughter that when she was a baby I had run away because I couldn't handle being a dad. I knew then that therapy alone wouldn't be enough. If my parents refused to confess and undo the damage, I would have to take legal action to keep them away. I wasn't going to let them destroy my bond with my children. I drove to my parents' house one last time, not to argue but to make things clear. They weren't going to see my children again unless they told them the truth. My mother barely let me finish before rolling her eyes. My father didn't even look up from his chair. They told me I was being dramatic, that I was poisoning the kids against them just because I didn't like what they had to say. I kept my voice steady, asking if they were really willing to let their grandchildren believe their father abandoned them just to prove a point. My mother shrugged. It's better than letting them get hurt when you disappoint them again. That was it. I turned and walked out. I blocked their numbers and every way they could contact me. Then I called a lawyer. I needed to know my options. The way my parents had gotten inside my daughter's head, the way my son was struggling to figure out what was real. It wasn't going to stop on its own. If I wanted to protect them, I needed legal backing. The lawyer explained the process, modifying custody agreements, cutting off unsupervised visits, and preventing my parents from inserting themselves into my children's lives without permission. My ex-wife agreed. After seeing the damage done, she was fully on board. She even offered to put something in writing, stating that our children's time with their grandparents was never meant to be this extensive. Then the rumors started. Relatives I barely spoke to before were suddenly calling, telling me I was being cruel and controlling. My mother had gone to them first, crying about how I was ripping the grandchildren away from them, how I was using my ex-wife to punish them. Some bought it, others didn't. My younger sister stayed on my side, telling me our parents were calling everyone they could to paint themselves as the victims. Meanwhile, my son was caught in the middle. He still loved his grandparents, even knowing they had lied to him. He told me he felt guilty. He wanted to believe me, but he had spent years trusting them. He didn't know how to separate what was true from what he had been told. My daughter, though, refused to see me unless she could also see my parents. She would barely talk when she did visit, spending most of the time curled up on the couch, refusing to engage. Then one evening, after another therapy session, she looked up at me for the first time in days and said, "You're the one ruining the family, not Grandma." I didn't react. I didn't argue. I just told her I loved her, that I would always be here for her, no matter what. She stared at me like she was waiting for me to break. I didn't. She turned away. A week later, my parents tried going around me. Gifts started showing up at my ex-wife's house. Packages with no return address, full of toys, letters, and little reminders of how much my parents loved their grandchildren. I called my lawyer again. A cease and desist letter was sent, warning them to stop interfering. They ignored it. Therapy started making a difference. My son slowly began to understand how manipulated he had been. He was still conflicted, but he was talking more, asking questions, trying to piece together the truth. My daughter, though, kept her walls up. When the therapist asked her why she trusted Grandma more than me, she just said, "She never left." Then my ex-wife made a decision. Until further notice, our children would not see my parents unless it was supervised by both of us. No more sleepovers, no more secret visits. That was the final trigger. My parents filed for grandparent visitation rights, their claim that I was unfairly keeping them from their grandchildren and harming them by taking away a stable, loving relationship. Now I wasn't just fighting for my kids in my home, I had to fight for them in court. A couple of months after my parents filed for grandparent visitation rights, the court papers arrived. Legal cases like these took time, but my parents were pushing to escalate the matter quickly. They were suing me, claiming that I was emotionally harming my children by cutting off contact with them. The wording made it sound as if I had been some cruel, vindictive parent who had ripped my kids away out of spite. It was almost laughable, if it weren't so infuriating. I called my lawyer immediately. He reassured me that their case was weak. Courts prioritize parental rights, and as long as I could prove that I had always been an active father, my parents had little ground to stand on. He advised me to stay calm, document everything, and prepare for them to escalate. That night I sat my kids down and explained the situation in simple terms. My son shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn. My daughter looked like she was about to cry. I reassured them that this wasn't their fault, that no matter what happened, I would always be there for them. My son nodded slowly. My daughter didn't respond. Then the phone calls started, not from my parents, since they were already blocked, but from extended family members. Some were demanding explanations, others were outright hostile. My mother had gotten to them first, spinning a story about how I was manipulating my kids, how I had turned them against their loving grandparents for no reason. Some of them believed her, others didn't. My younger sister texted me, warning me that my mother was calling anyone who would listen, sobbing about how I had stolen her grandchildren from her. Then my parents made their next move. They reached out to my ex-wife, trying to pressure her into testifying against me in court. They told her she needed to stand up for them, that she was the only one who could fix this mess. She refused. She wasn't their biggest fan to begin with, but now, after seeing what they had done to our kids, she wanted no part of their drama. The stress started weighing on my son. He withdrew slightly, avoiding conversations about the case. He told me he felt guilty for still loving his grandparents, even after everything. I told him love wasn't something he had to force or deny. It was okay to feel conflicted. I wasn't going to tell him how to feel. He just nodded and changed the subject. Then my younger sister called me with an offer. She had kept her distance from our parents for years, but after hearing what was happening, she wanted to testify on my behalf. She had seen firsthand how they manipulated people, how they twisted the truth when it suited them. She was willing to go to court and expose them. A few days later, my son revealed something that solidified my decision to take this all the way. He told me about another lie his grandmother had told him. Apparently, she had claimed that when my daughter was a baby, I had run away because I couldn't handle being a father. That was why my parents had to step in and raise them. I called my lawyer again. He suggested using our children's therapist as a witness. The therapist could provide a professional statement about the emotional harm caused by my parents' interference. It was a solid move. Then my ex-wife took a stand. She didn't just refuse to help my parents, she actually agreed to testify for me. She admitted that for years, she had unknowingly enabled their lies by allowing the kids to spend so much time with them, assuming they were just being helpful grandparents. Now, after seeing the damage, she wanted to set the record straight. After months of back-and-forth legal motions, the first court hearing was finally scheduled. My parents walked in acting like victims, playing the role of loving grandparents who had been unfairly cut off. Their lawyer painted them as the only stable figures in my children's lives, claiming that I had suddenly decided to erase them out of nowhere. Then my lawyer presented our case. He laid out my history as an active parent, my documented custody arrangement, and most importantly, the evidence of manipulation. My sister testified, explaining how our parents had always controlled the narrative in our family, twisting facts until only their version of reality remained. The therapist provided a statement detailing the psychological impact of their lies on my kids. My ex-wife testified, admitting that she had ignored the warning signs for too long. Then I took the stand. I calmly explained how my parents had rewritten history, how they had made my children believe I had abandoned them when I had been there the whole time. I talked about the emotional toll, about how my daughter now saw me as the enemy because of their lies. That was when my mother snapped. She stood up shouting that I was the one brainwashing the kids, that I was ripping them apart from the only family who ever truly cared for them. The judge immediately ordered her to sit down, but the damage was done. Everyone in that courtroom saw her for what she was. Even her own lawyer looked embarrassed. The judge didn't rule immediately, but they did issue a temporary order. Full discretion over grandparent visits would remain with me until the final hearing. It wasn't over yet, but it was a victory. That night, I blocked every direct way my parents could contact me. Email, social media, phone numbers. They had no more direct access to me, but I knew they would try other ways. Now they had to face the reality they had created. My ex-wife called me in the middle of the day, her voice sharp with panic. Our daughter was missing. She had never made it to her after-school program. Her teacher thought she had left with a family member, but no one had signed her out. I left work immediately, calling the school, the police, and anyone I could think of. My son was still in class, unaware of what was happening. My ex-wife was already searching the neighborhood. Then, an hour later, she called again. She had found our daughter, at my parents' house. My ex-wife arrived before me. When she knocked on their door, my mother answered like nothing was wrong. My daughter was sitting inside, drinking hot chocolate on the couch, looking perfectly comfortable. My ex-wife pushed past my mother and pulled her outside immediately. When I got there minutes later, my daughter wouldn't even look at me. My mother folded her arms, acting like she had done nothing wrong. She claimed my daughter had called for help, that she was terrified of losing them and needed to be rescued. I told her she had crossed the line for the last time. The police showed up shortly after. While my daughter had willingly gone there, they made it clear this bordered on custodial interference. They filed a formal report, warning that further incidents could result in serious legal consequences. My parents didn't seem to care. Back at home, my daughter refused to speak to me. She sat in her room, curled up on her bed, staring at the wall. She was convinced I was the villain, that I was trying to take away the only family who truly loved her. She ignored my attempts to explain, shutting down completely. My lawyer called that night. He had been monitoring the situation closely, and after this latest incident, he advised that we now had grounds for a restraining order. My ex-wife agreed. She had seen enough. My son, though, had seen enough too, but in a different way. The moment he heard what had happened, something in him shifted. He was furious. He didn't say much at first, just sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Then later, when we were alone, he finally spoke. Why do they keep doing this? He was starting to see the truth, but my parents weren't done. Days later, I was served with another set of legal documents. This time, they weren't just asking for visitation rights. They were filing for emergency custody. Their claim, that I was emotionally abusing my children by cutting them off from the only stable family they had. I called my lawyer immediately. He wasn't surprised. He had seen cases like this before, grandparents who refused to accept boundaries, who escalated until they lost everything. He reassured me that the court would not take their claims seriously, especially with the police report on file. The first court date was set within a week. My ex-wife was prepared to testify. She told the court that I was a stable, involved father and that the only instability came from my parents' interference. My lawyer presented the police report, the therapist's statements, and my parents' repeated attempts to manipulate my children. The judge dismissed the emergency custody request immediately. There was no valid reason to remove my children from my care, but a final hearing was scheduled to determine whether my parents would be granted any visitation rights. The tension in the house was unbearable. My daughter had an emotional breakdown after hearing about the court case. She screamed that she hated me for making her choose between me and her grandparents. She cried until she was shaking, gasping for breath, completely overwhelmed. My ex-wife had to hold her until she calmed down. Then, my parents made one last attempt. A letter arrived in the mail, addressed to both of my children. The message inside was simple: no matter what happens, we will always be waiting for you. We love you more than anything. We hope you find your way back to us one day. I didn't even hesitate. I sent a copy of the letter to my lawyer. It was further proof of their manipulation, another attempt to plant seeds of doubt in my children's minds. That same week, we formally filed for a restraining order. Then, my son did something I hadn't expected. He called my parents himself. I wasn't in the room when it happened, but when he came to me afterward, his face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. I asked him what they said. He took a deep breath and repeated their words. You will understand when you're older. The final court hearing was coming. I knew this was the moment that would decide everything. My parents thought they could manipulate their way out of this, that they could twist reality to fit their version of the truth. But I wasn't going to let them. Not anymore. The final court hearing arrived. My ex-wife and I walked in together, our lawyers prepared. Across the room, my parents sat stiffly, their lawyer whispering to them. My mother's eyes were red, but whether it was from stress or an act for the courtroom, I couldn't tell. My father looked as indifferent as ever. The tension in the room was suffocating. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. My parents' lawyer went first, delivering a dramatic speech about how my parents were being unfairly cut off from their beloved grandchildren. He painted them as nothing but loving grandparents, suddenly and cruelly removed from their lives without reason. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue for effect. Then, my lawyer stood. He laid out the facts. The lies, the manipulation, the documented interference. The police report from when my daughter had run away to their house. The letters they had sent, attempting to turn my children against me. Then came the testimonies. My younger sister was first. She didn't hold back. She explained how our parents had spent years rewriting reality to suit their version of the truth. How they had always found ways to make themselves the victims, twisting stories and using guilt as a weapon. She detailed how she had watched them do the same thing to my children, until I finally put a stop to it. Then the therapist took the stand. She explained the effects of manipulation on children, how my daughter's anxiety and deep mistrust stemmed directly from my parents' influence. She talked about my son's guilt, the way he had struggled to separate truth from fiction, how years of carefully planted lies had made it difficult for him to trust his own father. My lawyer then played a voicemail, a message my mother had left weeks before I cut off contact. Her voice rang through the courtroom, filled with bitterness. She insulted me, called me an unfit parent, said my kids deserved better than to be raised by someone like me. The room fell silent when it ended. Then the judge turned to my parents. He asked them directly, did they acknowledge the harm they had caused? They didn't hesitate. My mother straightened, her voice firm. We only did what was right for the children. My father nodded in agreement. That was all the judge needed to hear. Then my ex-wife testified. She confirmed that I had always been an active, involved father, that I had never abandoned my children, that the only chaos in their lives had come from my parents' constant interference. She admitted she had allowed it to happen for too long, but now she was putting a stop to it. Then my daughter was asked if she wanted to continue seeing her grandparents. She hesitated. The entire courtroom waited. Then in a barely audible voice, she said, I don't know what's true anymore. My son, however, had no hesitation. He sat up straight and spoke clearly, his voice unwavering. They lied to us. They made me hate my dad for no reason. My mother flinched like she had been struck. Panic started setting in on their side of the courtroom. Their lawyer tried to recover, shifting the argument. Now they weren't controlling or manipulative. They were just concerned for the children's well-being. They had only ever tried to protect them. But it was too late. The judge made his decision. The petition for visitation rights was denied. They had no legal claim to my children. Further attempts to interfere would result in legal consequences. My parents were officially legally cut off. Outside the courtroom, my mother lost it. She screamed at me, her voice shrill, accusing me of brainwashing my kids, of turning them against their real family. My father walked away without a word. My daughter still didn't look at me. The ruling had gone in my favor, but the damage wasn't instantly undone. The years of manipulation weren't something that could be erased overnight. I could protect my children legally, but emotionally, the battle wasn't over. Later that night, my son hugged me. A real hug, not just the automatic kind he had been giving me for months. My daughter, though, stayed curled up on the couch, staring at the floor. The fight was over, but the healing was just beginning. The silence was unsettling. After the court ruling, my parents didn't reach out. Not directly, not through extended family, not even through fake numbers or emails. It wasn't relief I felt. I knew them too well. This wasn't over. They weren't the type to accept a loss and walk away. They were likely planning their next move. At home, the tension hadn't disappeared. My daughter refused to talk about them. Any mention of my parents, even indirectly, made her shut down. She wasn't angry, not outwardly, but there was a weight on her shoulders that wasn't there before. My son noticed too. He tried to help, reassuring her that our grandparents were wrong, that what they did wasn't okay. She didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. Then, a call came from the school. My daughter had gotten into an argument with a classmate, a heated one. Apparently, another kid made a comment about bad parents, something unrelated to our situation, but it set her off. She had shouted at the kid, telling them they had no idea what a bad family was. The teacher intervened before it escalated further. No one was hurt, but it was enough to raise concern. That was when I realized how much anger she had been bottling up. Then came the fallout from extended family. A family friend reached out, warning me that my parents had been telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated the court, that I had stolen my children from them using legal loopholes. They weren't reaching out to me directly anymore, but they were making sure their version of the story was spreading. Some distant relatives believed them. Others saw through the act. I didn't care what they thought. I wasn't going to waste time defending myself to people who weren't part of my life anyway. My ex-wife, however, was more concerned about what was happening at home. She had noticed our daughter withdrawing more, spending more time alone, avoiding certain conversations. She suggested an additional therapist, someone who specialized in childhood trauma. I agreed. The therapist took a different approach. Instead of forcing discussions about my parents, she suggested that we stop bringing them up entirely for now. Let the kids process things naturally. If they wanted to talk, they would. If not, they would eventually get there on their own time. It wasn't an easy adjustment, but I followed the advice. Then, just when I thought my parents had finally accepted reality, I found out about the letters. One of the other parents at school mentioned something in passing to my ex-wife. My mother had given letters to a classmate's parent, asking them to pass them along to my daughter. The message inside was clear. They still loved her. They were waiting. One day, she would understand why they had done what they did. I immediately contacted my lawyer. This was a direct violation of the court's ruling. It didn't matter that they hadn't sent the letters themselves. The intent was clear. My lawyer advised me to proceed with filing a restraining order. The same night, my daughter broke down. She sobbed, saying she didn't want Grandma and Grandpa to die hating her. That was when I truly saw the damage they had done. They had built so much guilt into her that even with everything that had happened, she still felt responsible for their emotions. I had a long conversation with both my kids. I explained that love should never come with conditions. It should never come with lies. My son nodded, understanding. My daughter hesitated, still torn between the family she had known and the reality she was trying to accept. The court approved the restraining order. Legally, my parents could no longer contact me or my children in any form. That was when they made their final move. One last dramatic email. The same theme they always played into. They had tried everything. They had fought for the family, and I was the one who had destroyed it. I didn't respond. I didn't even read it all the way through. Then I blocked them. Every account, every method of contact. For the first time, there was nothing left for them to hold on to. Now the real work began. The healing. The rebuilding. It wouldn't happen overnight. My daughter still had doubts. My son still had questions. But for the first time, it felt possible. My ex-wife called late in the evening. Our daughter had received a direct message on social media from an anonymous account. The message was short but unsettling. "We miss you. Do not forget us." The moment I saw the message, I knew. My parents weren't done. I checked the account. It had no posts, no followers, and no identifiable profile picture. Just the message. I started digging, tracing what little information I could. The police later confirmed that the IP address used to create the account was linked to my parents' home network. I took screenshots of everything and reported it to the police. Since the restraining order was already in place, they took it seriously. They advised me to block the account and reassured me that they would investigate further. That night, my daughter refused to sleep alone. She curled up in her bed, her eyes darting to the windows, convinced my parents would find a way to take her. She whispered that she had nightmares about waking up somewhere else, somewhere she didn't want to be. My son sat beside her, telling her over and over that she was safe, that no one was coming for her. My ex-wife, who had tried to stay neutral in the beginning, had no more doubts. She called the next day, saying she wanted to add extra security measures, new locks, camera systems, anything to make sure our daughter felt safe. I agreed without hesitation. Then came the next blow. A family friend reached out, warning me about something I hadn't even considered. One of my cousins, someone who had claimed to support me through this entire ordeal, had been secretly feeding my parents information about my kids. I confronted them. They didn't deny it. They said they felt bad for my parents, that they deserved to know something. They had been passing along small updates, nothing major, just little details, where the kids were going for the weekend, how they were handling the court case. My parents had lost direct access, so they had used my cousin to keep tabs. I cut contact immediately, blocked their number, sent a message to the extended family, making it clear, anyone helping my parents in any way was done. No warnings, no second chances. My daughter overheard the conversation. Later that night, she broke down. She sobbed that she didn't know who to trust anymore. First her grandparents, now family members she had once thought were safe. She curled up, shaking, refusing to talk. I felt helpless. I called a child psychologist, explaining everything. They suggested a new approach, giving my daughter an outlet, a way to express her emotions without pressure. Talking hadn't worked. Maybe writing would. The next day, I sat down with her. I told her we were going to start journaling together, not to show anyone, not to send, just to get feelings out of her head. I promised her that no one would ever read what she wrote unless she wanted them to. She hesitated, then finally agreed. Slowly we started writing. Letters to no one. Letters to the people who had hurt her. Letters about how unfair everything felt. Letters about what she missed, even if she knew it wasn't real. My son, meanwhile, had changed. He wasn't struggling with confusion anymore. He had become protective. Anytime my daughter got quiet, he would sit with her. Anytime she started doubting things again, he reminded her that they were safe, that nothing would happen, that their grandparents would never reach them again. Then the police called back. They had traced the fake social media account. The location matched my parents' house. The message had come directly from them. Now the restraining order violation wasn't just a technicality. It was evidence of continued harassment. My parents were now facing potential legal consequences. I knew I didn't have to do anything else. Their downfall was out of my hands. I had wasted too much time fighting them, trying to undo what they had done. Now my only focus was on my children, helping them heal, making sure they never had to feel unsafe again. This time it wasn't about winning, it was about moving forward. The final court case arrived faster than expected. My parents had officially been charged with violating the restraining order. They pleaded not guilty, but the evidence was overwhelming. The police had traced the fake social media account directly back to their home. The letters they had secretly sent through my daughter's classmate's parent had already been documented. Every attempt they made to reach my children after the ruling had been collected, time-stamped and presented to the judge. My parents tried to argue that they had done nothing wrong, that they were simply concerned grandparents who were being unfairly punished for loving their family. They claimed I had brainwashed my children, and that they had only reached out because they had no choice. Their lawyer tried to push the idea that the restraining order was too harsh, that my actions were extreme. But then the prosecution played the evidence, screenshots of messages, logs of every time they had tried to go around the court order, and the voicemail my mother had left, spewing insults and claiming my kids deserved better. The judge didn't hesitate. A permanent restraining order was issued. My parents would never be allowed to contact my children again. Any attempt to do so would result in immediate legal consequences. It was over. After the ruling, I heard through extended family that my parents' reputations had been destroyed. The relatives who once believed their sob stories now saw the truth. Some cut ties with them completely. Others kept their distance. My parents had built their entire identity around the idea that they were the victims, that they had been wronged. But now no one was buying it. Back home, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. The legal battle was over, but the damage they had caused still lingered. My daughter had been avoiding talking about them for weeks. I finally sat her down and told her everything. About the lies, the manipulation, the way they had twisted reality to turn her against me. She didn't argue. She didn't defend them. For the first time, she just cried. She whispered that she wished they hadn't lied to her. That was the turning point. My son, fully aware of the truth now, became his sister's emotional support. He reminded her constantly that they were safe, that no one was coming for them, that the people who hurt them were gone for good. Therapy was slow, but I started seeing the changes. My daughter began talking more. Her nightmares became less frequent. She no longer flinched when she heard my phone ring, no longer hesitated before hugging me. The anxiety that had weighed her down for so long started to fade. Then, one day, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address, no markings, just my name on the front. I knew before even opening it. It was from my mother. The contents were predictable. One last desperate attempt to shift the blame. She accused me of destroying the family, of turning my children against her, of being a cruel, ungrateful son. There was no apology, no remorse, just another twisted version of reality where she was the victim. I didn't even read the whole thing. I threw it away. Then I took the final steps to close every possible loophole they could use to find us. I updated my address protections, locked down legal measures to prevent them from ever interfering again. They were gone. Permanently. Months passed without incident. The silence that once felt unsettling now felt like peace. My children began to feel normal again. My daughter no longer feared being taken away. My son laughed more freely. The shadow my parents had cast over us had finally begun to disappear. My ex-wife admitted she had never truly seen how bad it was until now. She acknowledged that my parents had been a much bigger problem than she ever realized. For the first time in years, we co-parented with full trust in each other. Then, one evening, while we were sitting together, my daughter looked up at me and said, "I think I'm ready to stop being mad at you." I almost couldn't breathe. I had spent so long fighting for this moment, wondering if it would ever come. I just nodded and told her, "That's okay. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were healing." To mark the end of it all, I took my children on a trip. Just the three of us. No tension, no anxiety, no fear of what was waiting back home. It was our first real happy memory, completely free from the past. We had broken the cycle, and this time no one could take that from us.